Hello and welcome to our first beginner tutorial. Today I would like to prepare with you our entry-level project for the more advanced tutorials. Let's get started with the Npm Init command, which creates our object notation file called package. This file contains information about the project packages and dependencies. To use Npm Init in the command line, you must have installed Node.js. Why do we need Node.js at all? There are two use cases for our project. Use case 1 for launching our UI5 application locally. Here you have the possibility through the project UI5 tooling, or you create your own server file. For both possibilities, I have linked you a video in the description. Use case 2, as soon as we work with the OData protocol through the SAP gateway or want to include a custom library in our project, our application must be available as a BSP in the backend system. For this, we can import our project structure through the Grunt plugin into the desired system. However, this only concerns users who develop outside the cloud platform. The video for the implementation of the Grunt plugin is linked in the description. Now together we can prepare the project structure of our UI5 application. For a more detailed explanation of the individual files or folders, I have linked you a video in the upper right corner. Index.html file holds the SAPUI5 bootstrap. The property resource root is the namespace for the root application and must be prefixed in every file like the example shown. In some cases, the component initialization must wait until all pre-required modules have been loaded. If this is the case, the component support module needs to be executed later, and you have to replace the onInit module execution in the bootstrap with a custom module. There are two different options for loading the bootstrapping variant. On the one hand, this can be loaded relatively from a web server. On the other hand, externally from a content delivery network, as shown in the example. We also have the option for reading a specific version. You can also use a complex syntax for property bindings. This complex syntax allows you to define additional binding information to be contained in the settings object, such as a formatter function. If you are working with XML views, make sure that you've turned on complex binding syntax in your Bootstrap script. The index.js file will be called only when the resource loading is successful. The init event triggers when the bootstrapping is successful, and the index.js file is called in the callback function for the init event. The property manifest controls when and from where to load the manifest for the component. When set to any truthy value, the manifest will be loaded asynchronously by default and evaluated before the component controller. If it is set to a falsy value other than undefined, the manifest will be loaded after the controller. The property name describes the package where the component is contained. This property can only be applied initially and is equal to the value resource roots in index.html. The content of the manifest file is a configuration object in JavaScript object notation format that contains all global application settings and parameters. The manifest file is called the descriptor for applications, components, and libraries and is also referred to as descriptor or app descriptor when used for applications. The property ID is a mandatory attribute that has to be provided in dot notation and specifies an ID for the project that must be unique in the system. It must match the namespace provided in the corresponding component.js. Note: the ID must not exceed 70 characters. It must be unique. This is checked in consistency checks, for example for the UI5 application index, which return an error in case of duplicate IDs. Possible values for the property type are application, component, library, or card. For our YouTube project, the type application is important because it describes a UI5 application. The EITN property is an optional attribute and contains a URL string to the properties file that contains the text symbols for the descriptor. Note, the path to the EITN file must not exceed 100 characters. If nothing is described, the default value is used to request a resource bundle. Specifies the root view that shall be opened. Corresponds to the entry point of the application in the front end. The mandatory property dependencies specifies the external dependencies that are loaded by the SAPUI5 core during the initialization phase of the component and used afterwards. MinUI5 version describes the minimum version of UI5 that your component requires. This information ensures that the features of the SAP UI5 runtime version of the component are available. Libs contains all the IDs of the libraries that the UI5 core should load for use in the component. In this section, our custom library will also be included in the advanced tutorials. The property resources specifies additional CSS resources of the component. The CSS files are automatically added to the head of the HTML page during runtime as a link tag. Note, the usage of JS resources is deprecated. The app configures several data models that are used throughout the app to update the views or to store additional configuration options. The templates instantiate the resource model automatically using the following configuration entries in the descriptor. When the component of the app is initialized, these models will be made available under the configured name throughout the app. You can access the model objects with the command getModel within your application. The component.js file is the component controller and provides the runtime metadata and the component methods. In productive use, the file is called component_preload.js. This file contains all the code of your application in a minified version. Static dependencies are loaded in the dependency declaration array of the sap.ui.define call. These dependencies are always loaded in advance before executing the define module. UI components are used to add rendering functionality and represent a screen area or element on the user interface. The following command calls the superclass init method of UI component and is therefore mandatory. The init function is automatically invoked by UI5 when the component is instantiated. We have now made some important adjustments and developments. Now I would like to start with our server, which we created at the beginning, and take a look at the application. Launching the developer console in the Chrome browser can be started by pressing the F12 key combination. We now see some legitimate error messages. The reason lies in the file manifest, in which we have defined an XML view with the name app as an entry point, which we have not created at all at this point. Then let's create some files. First, we create our XML view where we define our controller for managing user interaction. Next, let's create the controller file where initializations as well as user interactions are handled. The static define dependency is a generic controller implementation for the UI5 model view controller concept. YTP corresponds to the namespace that was also assigned to the resource roots property in the file index.js. Let's restart the application and see what we get. We still have the error concerning the missing translation file EITN.properties, in which it is currently looking for the text for ID, app title, and app description from the manifest file. In this tutorial, we will only have one properties file. However, in real-world projects, you would have a separate file for each supported language with a suffix for the local, like our second file with the extension DE, which stands for the language German. Writing the application text is simple. On the left, we have the ID, which was assigned to an object, and on our right, we write our text, which should be displayed in the front end. Furthermore, EITN files only impact client-side application texts. Texts that are loaded from back-end systems can appear in all languages that are supported by the back-end system. There is no naming convention for creating the CSS file, but the name of the file and the definition in the manifest file must be identical. Let's include a few more elements in our XML view before reloading our application in the front end. For the function button, I want to define a dynamic text which is controlled by the translation file EITN. The first part is the name of the model instance we defined in the manifest file, and the second part is the translation ID in the EITN file. To display the button text, we only need to add some text to the translation ID save. We have now successfully implemented all the developments for our beginner tutorial today. Now we can once again update our application in the front end and marvel at our work.